We've implanted one person with our device in May of this year. For someone who's lost the ability to speak, lost the ability to move, the signals don't make it from the brain to the body, but they're still there. So if you take a device like this and you place it in an area of the brain called the motor cortex, you can allow people who have lost the ability to speak again. The device that I just showed you is the highest data rate VCI in the world. We've clocked it at 200 bits per second, which is 20 times higher data rate than Neuralink has ever demonstrated, that are being used to stimulate deeper parts of the brain for things like depression, essential tremor, Parkinson's, obsessive compulsive disorder.
What would happen if the company went bankrupt?
That is a great question.
Paradromics is an American neurotechnology company developing the world's highest bandwidth brain-computer interface. Their device connects directly to neurons in the brain, allowing people who have lost the ability to speak or move to communicate again, using only their thoughts. Paradromics is not just a competitor to Neuralink. It's setting a new standard for restoring and enhancing human function. This interview was made possible thanks to GITEX Global in Dubai.
What the Paradromics is?
So Paradromics builds high data rate brain-computer interfaces, which are essentially modems that connect brains to computers. So I have one in my pocket today. This is an example of a high data rate brain-computer interface. You can place it on the surface of the brain. It has 421 platinum iridium microwires, and these wires can record from individual neurons. So why is that interesting? Well, for someone who's lost the ability to speak, lost the ability to move, they have signals in their brain that are trying to tell their body what to do. They're trying to direct their mouth, their tongue, and their larynx to produce speech, or they're trying to direct the hands to move, but the signals don't make it from the brain to the body. But they're still there. So if you take a device like this and you place it in an area of the brain called the motor cortex, you can allow people who have lost the ability to speak again through a computer.
Looks like Neuralink.
Neuralink is the other high data rate brain-computer interface company in the world. So there are two companies that are building these kinds of capabilities, and actually, interestingly, both are primarily located in the city of Austin, Texas.
What's the difference from Neuralink?
So the device that I just showed you is the highest data rate VCI in the world. We've clocked it at 200 bits per second, which is 20 times higher data rate than Neuralink has ever demonstrated. But I actually think the most important difference between our device and the Neuralink device comes down to longevity. We've had these devices implanted in sheep now for more than 3 years, where we've been monitoring the signal quality over time, and we haven't seen any changes in signal quality over time. And the materials that we've used for the devices are ceramics and metals, things that will be there 10 years from now. That's because from Paradromics' standpoint, and giving someone a brain implant is a huge commitment. Someone is going to undergo neurosurgery, they're going to get a device, and they're expecting that the function you provide to them on day one will be the function that you're providing to them many years later. Neuralink, from its outset, had a very different opinion about brain-computer interfaces. They think that they're the next cell phone. And so accordingly, they've built systems that don't have a very long life expectancy because they think that people will want to replace them every few years, just like you would a cell phone. We think that that's not calibrated with where people are today or where they're likely to be in the next 10 or 20 years.
Does it true that you've corrected the biggest database?
We have the greatest bandwidth connection between brains and computers, and that means we have the capacity to build the greatest database of neural recordings ever. I don't know who currently has the single largest database of neural data. I actually wouldn't know the answer.
Does Paradromics reserve the right to remotely update, switch off, or modify the implant in the patient brain?
Well, I would say that those things are not all equivalent. So the switching off a patient's device when they're relying it as on it as their primary means of communication would be inhuman. So no, we definitely don't reserve the right to switch off someone's brain implant at any time. It's not like no, we have no intention of doing that. We're not, we see a brain-computer interface as a medical device that someone purchases to get better. It's not the kind of thing where you would sell someone a subscription model and then gate their using it on their ability to pay. That would be that would be inhuman. Now, the ability to update the device is actually really important. As you know, a brain-computer interface is a link between your brain and a computer system, and computer systems change. So the operating system, the standards that are running on your computer today may not be the same ones that are running on your computer 2, 3, 4 years from now. And so there is definitely an important aspect of keeping the software updated. That would be something that we, certainly the patient could, you know, agree or not agree to update the software as they saw fit. But I think being able to update software, I wouldn't see that as a negative thing. I would see that as a positive thing.
What will happen to patients in Paradromics is acquired goes bankrupt?
That is a great question. There aren't great structures in place to support medical devices for patients who receive devices from defunct companies. I'll suggest that one way that you can better provide for patients is to have better recurring revenue models for things like software support. So it's interesting, you were bringing up the Black Mirror episode and kind of subscription models in a sort of dystopian way, but I would actually suggest that having the ability for particularly payers, not necessarily individuals, but payers like national governments or private health plans, to pay for software updates for medical devices can actually be part of the solution to supporting devices when they become abandoned by their companies, because it means that you have a recurring revenue model for servicing those devices, which means that even if the original company goes out of business, there's now a business model for another company to come and support those devices.
How does it look like that, you know, implementation process?
Yeah. So the first step to getting a high data rate brain-computer interface is that you have to surgically implant it in the brain. There are brain-computer interfaces that can pick up signals from the scalp or from outside of the brain, but the signal-to-noise ratio and the total amount of data that you can get from a device like that is relatively low. Let's say roughly 1 bit per second under good conditions. And then there are devices that sit just under the skull on the surface of the brain, but don't have the ability to reach down into the layers of the brain and record from individual neurons. Those devices have, let's say, on the order of 10 bits per second maximum that they can deliver. And then you have devices like the Paradromics device or the Neuralink device that can record from individual neurons. These devices are implanted on the surface of the brain, but they reach down, let's say, at least 1 millimeter into the brain tissue and get close to the neurons. And when you do that, then you can start delivering like very high data rates. That's going to be the future of brain-computer interfaces, because the more neurons you can record from, the more data you have. So the first step is implanting a device in the brain. Our particular device then has a wire that runs under the skin down to the chest, and there's a wireless power and data system that sits under the skin at the chest that receives wireless power and sends out wireless data. After the patient recovers from surgery, they now have a device in their motor cortex so that every time that they attempt to do something, the neurons in that brain area are active as they would have been before the brain implant, but now the brain implant can read the activity of the individual neurons and send that data out to a computer, and the computer can infer after some training what they were attempting to do. For what someone was trying to do, in the case of a speech prosthesis, that means understanding what words they were trying to say and then producing either text on a screen or producing sound directly from the computer. In the case of motor prosthesis, it can determine if it's in a different area of the brain, it can read out attempted hand movement so that a person can control a robotic arm or even mind write characters by thinking about writing characters with their hand.
Do you have your first patients?
We've implanted one person with our device in May of this year. Now that wasn't a patient in a clinical study. That was a participant that was undergoing epilepsy surgery that volunteered to have this device placed in the area of their brain that was right before it was going to be removed as part of the epilepsy surgery. So, that was a really important moment for the company because we demonstrated that the device worked in humans the same as it had in all of our preclinical studies in sheep, but it didn't actually provide benefit to the person who volunteered. It was purely altruistic on their part. Now, in the first part of next year, we're expecting approval from the FDA to begin our clinical trial for people who have lost the ability to speak. So the first person to get a Paradromics brain implant and use it to speak will be early next year.
How does it work, that first implant?
Someone will come into a hospital who is paralyzed. They'll receive a brain implant in an area of their motor cortex called 6V. They'll wake up healthy and recovered from surgery, and then a few weeks later they'll begin essentially a rehabilitation process where they're learning to use the device. They're learning to attempt to speak again. They're being prompted by the computer to say certain things. After what we expect to be a few hours of training, they will begin speaking using the device.
You spoke about the potential of brain-computer implant in treating depression and addiction. How does that work?
Yeah, there are already brain-computer interfaces that are being
And addiction?
used. Yeah, I believe so. So there are deep brain stimulators right now, which are types of brain-computer interfaces that are being used to stimulate deeper parts of the brain for things like depression, essential tremor, Parkinson's, obsessive-compulsive disorder. In some cases, they can be effective, but I guess one of the limitations of the systems right now is that our readout of the systems is relatively limited. We are looking for clinical readout. In the case of Parkinson's or essential tremor, we're looking for a tremor reduction. In the case of depression, we're looking for self-reported outcomes. Something that a device like the one I showed you can do for those kinds of paradigms is directly decode neural states, so that instead of shooting in the dark and relying on self-evaluation and checklists and conversations with a psychiatrist or a neurologist, we can use brain data directly to understand when therapies are working. And that doesn't even have to be device-based therapies. We can also imagine using brain-computer interfaces to read out the efficacy of more traditional interventions like pharmacology or cognitive behavioral therapy. I think that the key thing that brain-computer interfaces will bring to mental health is a way to quantify whether something's working or not, looking at biomarkers for things like mood and attention and other things.
You would like to dedicate your brain-computer interface to millions of people around?
We want to build hardware that is enabling for an expansive list of applications. I mean, essentially, the brain is a data organ. Everything that we see, everything that we experience is data. Everything that we do originates as data in our motor cortex that's sent out to the muscles in our body. Cognition is neural data. Mood is essentially neural states, which you can say are neural data. And so a brain-computer interface can read and write neural data, which means that it can treat just about any neurological condition or most physical conditions that relate to a breakdown of the brain and the body. And so we want to just keep building better and better hardware so that we can do more and more for the brain using these devices.
Still, we have no idea how human brain works in any single details. We have no idea what consciousness is. That's something that we can call mystery of the human brain.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, yes, everything you just said is true. The brain is still mysterious and much of it is unknown. But I think that the beauty of neural engineering is that we don't have to completely understand the human brain in order to provide meaningful brain therapies. If you look at, let's take for instance the vaccine. The first vaccines were being used successfully and saving millions of lives more than 100 years before we even really understood what antibodies were. In the 1700s, people were getting effectively vaccines against smallpox, and yet we didn't understand the molecular biology of how the genetic material that form antibodies are rearranged until the 1970s. We essentially didn't understand the detailed mechanisms of the immune system until the modern era, and yet vaccines were saving people before that. We don't understand perfectly how motor representations occur in motor cortex, and how neural circuits, form motor intentions and motor planning. But what we can do is we can listen to the motor cortex, and we can instruct a person to attempt to make movements. And after they attempt to make a number of repeated movements, we can build a decoder to predict what movement they're trying to make based on their brain activity. We don't really understand at a detailed nuts and bolts level all the computations that are going on that precede movement, but what we do know is that we can predict what someone's trying to do based on their brain activity. And I think that pragmatic solutions like that will allow us to go into a lot of different brain areas and say, maybe we don't know all of the neurobiology of attention or of depression, but if we can understand when someone's paying attention and when they're not, or if we can understand when someone's depressed and when they're not, we can use that signal to help people optimize their life.
What's that missing link that, limit your possibility to serve millions of your brain-computer interfaces around the world?
I think one of the most important things that we'll have to tackle at a societal level, at a government level, is paying for brain-computer interfaces, getting them reimbursed across a range of conditions, getting them reimbursed at the right payment numbers to make the early economy of brain-computer interfaces work and scale quickly.
What's the cost of one brain-computer interface?
We expect that our first brain-computer interface in the first market of restoring speech will have an average selling price of $150,000 when it goes to market initially. The goal would be that as we start scaling that out, we can bring the cost down to be more in line with the cost of deep brain stimulators and other neuromodulation devices that you see in the world, which would be, let's say, in the $30,000 to $50,000 range.
How that idea was born inside your brain?
Oh, I would love to claim credit for brain-computer interfaces, but there have been, 20 years of robust clinical science in the area of brain-computer interfaces, and before that, 100 years of excellent neurophysiological experiments that, made all of this possible. I think that there was no single eureka moment on the part of any one BCI researcher, but I think it's been a gradual building of capabilities and demonstrating of exciting clinical applications.
This is a question from our viewers. Who legally owns the algorithm that learns and filters by thoughts before they are uttered?
In our first product, that's not strictly true.
Yeah.
In our first product, we're recording from an area of the brain that is, I would say, downstream from decision making. It's the last area of the brain that tells your muscles exactly how to move. The motor cortex is activated when you try to move and you try to do something. So in that case, it doesn't really precede intention. It follows intention. Now, there are other areas of the brain where you can do speech decoding that are a little bit upstream. Like there's an area called the superior temporal gyrus that represents internal speech, like internal monologue. It also represents received speech. So right now, as I'm speaking to you, if someone had a brain implant in your superior temporal gyrus, they would hear my voice. Or if, while you're listening to me, you're thinking, that sounds like bullshit, then it would hear that as well. It hears that kind of internal monologue. And they haven't been as investigated yet, but there are areas of the brain that are upstream to that as well that would represent, pre-language kind of semantic and abstract information. But those aren't areas that are being used right now for communication.
Why there is no publicly open papers?
There actually are some really good published papers. There's a New England Journal of Medicine paper from David Brandman's group. The first author is Nick Card, and they're a computational collaborator.
Yeah, but I'm asking you about your papers.
Oh, we recently put out a preprint on bioRxiv describing our benchmarking. So when I described to you that this device is the fastest BCI in the world at 200 bits per second, we actually published that last week on bioRxiv. So all of the methods are described, so anyone who wants to can read about how we did it.
What are you working on now?
What we're working on right now is we are taking this device that I just had in my pocket that we've tested extensively in sheep, and we're bringing it into a first-in-human trial in the US under what's called an investigational device exemption. And so early next year, patients will receive our brain implant who can't speak and use it to communicate again. Now it's definitely true to your point. I think what you were getting at is that companies do not publish as frequently as science labs do. They often keep what they're doing before they're ready to announce it a little bit closer to the chest for reasons of intellectual property, trade secrets, strategy. But I think what you will see is as the devices are going into clinical trials and the clinical trials results are being reported, you'll see those being published in peer review publications because that's an important part of building up toward ultimately getting the devices paid for by governments and private payers.
What's your roadmap? When we can expect from your company first huge-scale implementations?
The first group of people that we want to help are people who can't speak any longer and have limited hand function. So in the US, that market is roughly 150,000 people, but with reimbursement of $150,000 per device, it's still a $20 billion plus market. That's where we want to start to get the company to a place where we're cash flow break even. But then the goal is that we'll continue to make every 3 years or so a new device that has twice as much data and has additional capabilities to be able to open up new markets. And so you can imagine, as we're describing, using these devices in mental health applications, using these devices to help control robotic arms, hands, eventually exoskeletons, and then also using these devices on the sensory side to restore lost senses.
What would happen when people, because of ethical aspects, would say no? We don't want brain-computer implants.
I think it's everyone's prerogative to say no. I don't think anyone should be forced to get a brain implant. But I think part of living in a pluralistic, liberal society is that I can say no for me, but I can't say no for you. I can say no to getting a device for me to browse the internet, but I shouldn't be able to say no to someone who's paralyzed and wants to talk to their family again. I can say no for me. I may not want a brain implant to do virtual reality, but I shouldn't be able to say no to someone who's blind who wants the same brain implant to be able to see again.
Do you think that in 50 years oral speech will be an outdated and ineffective form of human communication?
I think that what will happen over the course of the next decades is that people who are getting brain implants to restore function, as to help them with their disability, will end up with certain forms of superpowers relative to what you and I have. I think that'll come naturally, so that, right now we sequence our thoughts and communicate with computers through natural language. That's how we communicate with ChatGPT and Claude and other AI models. But you can imagine that someone who has a really advanced brain implant, because they're paralyzed, they might begin communicating directly with AI models in a way that is even precedes natural language. And so, yeah, I could imagine that there would be people who have these interesting abilities that are hard for me to intuit right now, that could be in some ways more advanced than the way we communicate with each other. But I don't expect that that's going to replace natural language or replace the way that humans choose to interact between ourselves. Not in the next 50 years, I would think.
What is the black swan scenario for Paradromics?
I would say that the worst case scenario for Paradromics and for the neurotech industry is that due to a lack of understanding of the technology, people fear it, and there are, let's say, arbitrary restrictions placed on the development of the technology. I think the worst case scenario for BCI and neurotechnology would be that because people are afraid of the aspects of neurotechnology that they don't understand, we leave on the table a lot of possible solutions for people that can be helped with the technology near term in a certain way.
How do you look at AI development era, AI revolution today?
There is an interesting relationship between AI and BCI. On one hand, AI tools can be very helpful for brain-computer interfaces. I'll give an example. Let's take a communications prosthesis. If someone has a BCI and they're trying to say something and they're talking really fast, let's say that they're talking so quickly and the brain-computer interface is trying to keep up and it misses a few words or it has a few errors. You can push, let's say, like a corrupt transcript or like a noisy recording through an AI model. And based on language modeling, based on the statistical regularities of speech, it can infill the mistakes and it can correct the mistakes. And so it can allow people to communicate faster with lower error rates using this sort of error correcting property of AI. There's also an interesting way in which I think BCI will help AI models, which is that right now, in some sense, like all of the AI models are trending toward a certain asymptote because they're all based on the same data that they have access to, namely the internet. But there's increasingly now an interest in trying to find more like physical world data to train AI on, find kind of new insights and new proprietary data sources to train powerful models on, foundational models. Brain data represents one of those data sources, and I think a lot of people are interested in training AI models on brain data to try to improve the performance of AI models.
Do you remember that moment when the idea of Paradromics was born?
It's interesting, just the same way I was telling you, I don't think there was any single person or any single breakthrough that really defined the BCI field. I also think that the decision to start Paradromics and the direction of Paradromics.
It was your, personal experience, something was happen, or?
I got into neural recording and neuroscience because I was interested in the brain. I was interested in building tools for the brain, and I wanted to build tools to help people understand the brain better. And when I was a postdoc at Stanford, I was building ways to talk to a lot of neurons at the same time, purely for research purposes. But I met a few of the leaders in the field, particularly the late Krishna Shenoy, who was a BCI researcher at Stanford. And I started talking with Krishna, Lee Hochberg at Mass General Hospital, and some of the other leaders in the field, and talking to them about what would it mean if we brought these technologies over into the clinic, where they were using older generation BCIs to help people with paralysis. And as a result of many conversations, I built increasing conviction that taking next generation technology into the clinic and leveling up the hardware that's available for people with paralysis and for researchers in the BCI field would really kind of open the aperture on the kinds of therapies that we could create for people.
What specific inscriptions or, security protocols have been implemented?
Oh, I have to admit, I'm actually not an encryption expert. So like, I know a lot about. I'm a technical CEO. I know a lot about the
But
technology.
they are.
Yeah, for sure. What I would say is that, with regard to like security protocols and encryption, getting to iPhone level encryption and security, where practically no individual persons could hack the device, that is essentially commodity. Getting to a point where the Chinese Communist Party, couldn't crack the device, or the U.S. government couldn't crack the device, like, 5, let's say, nation-state actors with really, really advanced capabilities, that's essentially out of scope for any technology company. So I think in the case of encryption and security, it's about understanding like what is possible and having a clear-eyed risk-benefit approach to access to the device. In other words, what I mean is for any of us to get a Paradromics device or to use an iPhone is relatively secure. But if you happen to be, the president of a large country, then you would need to take additional security measures.
In the next 10 years, 20 years, which the most futuristic vision of your brain-computer interface use cases you can imagine?
I think, where the technology is trending toward is eventually BCIs will have enough bandwidth to be able to provide immersive sensory experiences that are indistinguishable from reality. Everything that we see comes to our brain through our retinas and through our thalamus and to our visual cortex. So a sufficiently high bandwidth visual BCI would be able to provide you a image in your mind's eye that is indistinguishable from the one that your eye does. So at that point, what you could imagine is, I always like to give the example, I was in Mycenae over the summer, ancient Greek city. It was the capital of the Greeks during the Trojan War. And if you go there now, it's basically, you can see the foundation on a hilltop. But when I was walking around, I thought, wow, it would be so amazing to have been here at the peak of the Mycenaean civilization. What would it have been like? With a sufficiently advanced BCI, you could just see what it would have been like. The world would sort of dissolve around you, and suddenly you would be back in time, and you would be surrounded by ancient Greeks, and you would be listening. I mean, essentially the generative AI technology to make that experience.
That's Black Mirror scenario a little bit.
You could say that those capabilities could be used for Black Mirror situations, but I don't think the capability is in itself intrinsically dystopian. I think it's the way that you use the technology.
Will your brain-computer interface take over human functions?
I hope it restores human functions. Yes, in some sense, yes, it will. For someone who loses their arm and gets a prosthetic arm, yes, it will be taking over human function of that arm.
Are you more engineers or futurists or philosophers? Who you are?
For me personally, I live in a home with, a wall full of books. I don't enjoy reading books on screens, and I actively try to get rid of screens from my home and reduce screen time for my entire family. So for me personally, I would say that I'm almost a bit of a Luddite. I don't see what I don't want to use BCI for is I don't want to repeat all of the mistakes of the smartphone industry and the, let's say, software application and social media industry of the last 20 years. I would argue that that smartphones, when we're looking at them, make us less happy. This world of intrusive notifications and pushing things to us, and getting software where we think that we're the user, and we find out that we're actually the product. We don't want to repeat that with the brain-computer interface industry. The connection to our brain is even more intimate than it is with a screen. What I'm excited about, initially the reason why I started doing this is because I want to restore function for people who have disabilities.
Could your implants make us more happy?
I think we have to be careful of that. There are a lot of pharmaceuticals, there are a lot of drugs that make people more happy for a short period of time, but erode our humanity and our autonomy over a longer period of time. So I think that's something we have to be very careful of. The capabilities that we're building are going to be very powerful. They're going to be able to allow a person who is depressed to choose not to be depressed again. But I don't think that we want to try to engineer away sadness in society, because I think that the whole spectrum of human emotion and human feeling is part of what makes us human. So what I was saying is I originally got into this field because I'm still motivated primarily by restoring function, but I also think now that Paradromics is leading in the field, we have a unique position to direct the course of the technology in a way that will be, let's say, affirming of what it means to be human, and increasing our agency and autonomy rather than decreasing it. And so I am very interested, as we're shepherding and this technology and acting as kind of stewards of it, to make sure that we do things that are good for people rather than bad for people.
If you could find answer for just only one question about the reality around what it would be.
One place where I would love to see some more science of the human mind is around attention. I'd love to see more science paid to how human beings attend to things, and so that we can
and judged, or how?
I think it would be great to be able to develop technologies that integrate more seamlessly with people in a way that's not cognitively burdensome. I'll just give you an example of, I actually love Teslas. They're very fun cars. I love electric cars. They have really fast acceleration. But there's one aspect of the design of Teslas that's now kind of infected every other modern car in a way that I don't appreciate, which is that they've replaced a lot of switches with big screens.
Okay.
And that doesn't really work very well with human attention, because you have to split your visual attention between, watching the road, assuming you don't have a self-driving car, and then watching the screen and trying to interact with the screen with swiping. In some ways, that's like a step backward for cognitive overhead, because whereas like a car from the 70s, or even from the early 2000s, switches and dials, you can touch them while still looking at the screen. It's very easy to split your attention between the sort of like physical manipulation of switches and dials and your visual attention paid to the road. I'm sure you have an intuition for what that's like to reach for the radio and turn it up and turn it down. But the moment that you have to go to a screen, it's competing for cognitive resources. You have to look at the screen, you have to navigate a menu, you have to find the thing that you're looking for. I think that was a step backward in car design. I'd love to see that rolled back. But as we're thinking about brain-computer interfaces, there are going to be a lot of other decisions that we make along the way that...
I think that is the question about a human intuition. What a human intuition is.
Yeah, we're going to be discovering a lot about human intuition over the next 20 years as we're recording from the brain while people are doing things, building interfaces that are helping people do things better.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.